So I'd like to begin there. Begin with your book, Black Gaze, and consider what perhaps it's proposing. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit of this sort of framework you're developing. Quote, a black gaze that shifts the optics of looking at to a politics of looking with, through, and alongside another. How does this maybe depart from what Bell Hooks wrote about in terms of the gaze in her essay, of course, Eating the Other, Desire and Resistance? And what is the sort of shift that's taking place here?
Right. I guess the best way to answer that is to talk a little bit about how I came to write about this thing that is called a black gaze, or that I'm calling a black gaze. And the first thing is that I'm not talking about the black gaze. It's really important that I emphasize that I'm talking about a black gaze, because I'm not talking about a singular gaze. I'm not talking about, and it's interesting, I can tell you what I'm not saying, and then I'll tell you what I'm saying. What I'm not saying is that there is one way of seeing that is black. I'm not saying that there is something called a black perspective. I don't believe in any of those things. I believe in a multiplicity of vantage points. And there was a way in which I was kind of forced into using that term against the pushback of a lot of artists that I was actually writing about, who said, you're crazy. Who said, how can you put together the term black and gaze? Those two things actually cancel each other out. And that's because the way in which the idea of the gaze has been formulated historically among theorists of film is that it is a top-down kind of thing. It is a repressive or oppressive way of understanding the politics of looking. And it's exploitative to the extent that within theories of cinema, a gaze, a male gaze, a colonizing gaze, all of these two things that get put together with the notion of a gaze is always about the negation of something. It's always about power and the exercise of power. And that exercise of power is primarily routed through pleasure. Who gets to enjoy looking at something? How are films constructed so that the pleasure taken in representation is usually a titillating pleasure, it's an exploitative pleasure, and it's usually directed against women, right? So the position of cinema has historically been from the position of a male director, right? So that was the first pushback, right, of black plus gaze equals Tina's crazy. But then my response to that was, the reason I had to talk about something called I came to call a black gaze, which I was really terrified of doing for the longest time, was because I was looking at the work of black artists that had two impacts. One was that they made people really uncomfortable. And not to the extent that they were shocking. It was that they were showing us something that we knew, we recognized. It was not the first time we saw it, but suddenly in that particular context of how they presented it to us, I would watch people cry, you know, and get really uncomfortable when I would share this work. And would ask me things like, you didn't prepare us for this. You didn't tell me what to expect. You didn't tell me it was going to be this emotional. And I would respond by saying, but this is stuff you've seen before.
Yeah.
You've seen it before. Why all of a sudden is it affecting you so intensely? And that's when I got to this idea of a black gaze, is that what I felt was different was that the ways in which the artists that I felt were making people uncomfortable, most uncomfortable, they were making us, and I include myself in that I was feeling uncomfortable, because suddenly I felt proximate, close to, implicated in what they were showing me. Even though I may have seen many of the representations that they were offering elsewhere, all of a sudden, in the ways in which they were presenting it, I suddenly felt my own complicity in the relationships that they were depicting. So when I came up with this term, a black gaze, it was really about not a black perspective, not a black vantage point, but a way of looking that makes me feel proximate to those relationships of blackness that I'm seeing. And so it's very active. And it's not directed towards white people or brown people. It's directed towards how do you situate yourself in the politics of looking at black subjectivity, black precarity, black subjection. And so it's a way of responding to work that also does not necessarily originate in black artists' work. So that's what the provocation that I'm actually trying to open up, is what if we were thinking about what kind of work art makes us do, right? When an encounter with an artwork is not passive. It's not, I see it, I do what I want to, I take it away, move on. What if we actually think about the ways in which artwork solicits responses from us that aren't always pleasurable? And what do we do with that? Do we, in turn, try and just paper over that and say, oh, that was uncomfortable, but it doesn't affect me? We can always do that. But there are certain artworks that make that much, much more difficult. And that's the artwork that I talk about as articulating a black gaze.
It's interesting, you brought up this sort of labor that one, as a viewer, as encountering a work that's asked, that a viewer is asked to engage with, or the labor of engaging with this work. And when you're speaking about one of Arthur Jafa's films, Love is the Message is Death, you speak about a sort of affective labor, a black gaze that does not allow its viewers to either be passive to its labor or impassive to its effects. It is a gaze that demands the affective labor of juxtaposition. And this idea of juxtaposition to me feels like quite a powerful lens in which to think about Frida's work as well, to think through and with this exhibition. And so my next question is, how do you see that juxtaposition and that labor functioning within this space and within the context of this exhibition and these works?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that is something that Frida and AJ's work shares, is what does it mean to bring different images together, and what are the effects of that? And I think that Frida, and in this show, I think one of the most amazing things is the way that juxtaposition works at so many different levels, right? So you have the juxtaposition of artwork and architecture, right? So, and you have spatial juxtapositions. You have scalar juxtapositions. So what is large and what is small, and what makes us feel smaller when we encounter it, right? So it reverses, again, the relations of viewing such that the scale of it and the way in which it's inhabiting this space makes us feel like we are being viewed, right? Juxtaposing different textures at different scales, again, creates a different relationship to how are we responding, right? That's something that we talked about yesterday, about how in my original encounters with Frida's work, it was smaller, right? That didn't mean it was less intense in terms of what it solicited, in terms of my responses, but we have to position ourselves differently. And so then there's the juxtaposition within different works, right? And again, that's where one goes into some of the formal aspects of the work and the role of collage, for example, about being able to see many different objects, pieces, in close proximity to one another. And to me, one of the things that does is it disorients us, right? Both in relation to who we are vis-a-vis the artwork. How are we supposed to be responding, right? As well as who is looking, right? That's something else that I also see that everyone will see. That's so strong throughout all of Frida's work, but this one in particular. I mean, I'm sitting here with all these eyes looking at me, right? So who is looking, right? And who is scrutinizing? And who is being scrutinized? And one of the things that juxtaposition does is it makes our position unstable.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Because you don't have, it is not a subject-object relationship. When the object comes alive, when the object has a kind of physical presence, when the object can direct looks at us to which we respond, even though we don't know who's looking, and especially when we don't know who is looking, right? Then we cannot continue with our practices of looking in a way that make us, and actually this goes back to, that make us, take us back to a comfortable place, and this goes back to the second part of your question that you asked previously that I didn't answer, about what the difference between a black gaze is and something like an oppositional gaze.
Yeah.
Of that bell hooks talked about so long ago. Bell Hooks' idea, and of course, like she was one of the major sort of interlocutors that I was speaking to when I was coming up with this idea. And what Bell Hooks talks about is the oppositional gaze was a practice of interrogation, of questioning, that Black communities taught themselves before there was Black representation in popular media and visual culture, before there was the possibility of creating our sense of who we are on television or in film, right? That did not mean that we were subordinated to all of the images, particularly the negative images that flowed into our lives. And this is an argument that I think that she was making not simply about Black communities, but any kind of marginalized community or non-dominant community, is that we have really intelligent practices of challenging the representations that we are confronting. But to me, that's a kind of responsiveness, right? That's responding to and still within the back and forth between media and individuals, right? It's still, we are being confronted with something, and how do we respond? And what I'm talking about in terms of a Black gaze is, what does it mean to create a new form of positionality, a fundamentally different relationship that is not responding, right? It is actually active and creating a different position for those who are watching, right? And so that's what I think is going on here, is that there's a different relationship that's being created, as opposed to, okay, how do I deal with these images? I know them. No, you don't know them anymore, right? Because the juxtaposition makes them strange. They're suddenly, we don't know where they're coming from. And even when we do, putting them in a different context means, so is this pornographic? Is this scientific, right? Is this documentary, right? Is this a family photograph? So if you don't, even when you recognize the context out of which it's arising, juxtaposing it in a different one, in a different media, in a different spatial form, at a different scale, suddenly creates a new possibility of interaction that, to me, is the most powerful, one of the most powerful outcomes of juxtaposition.
So the found images in, and you sort of you began touching on some of on this point, but the found images in Orupabo's work are, of course, from a number of different sources, both popular culture, medical examination, colonial archives, among many others. And some of these images carry with them a great violence, of course, the violence of colonialism, of racism, of gender-based violence, as in Cloud of Confusion and House Party. But in other works, there's a sense of affirmation, even pleasure. I would say that is happening here in her. So my next question is, and you speak about this in your text, what is at stake in Orupabo's work in using these images and reshaping them, sort of imagining them? It's a tough question.
Yes, it is. But it's an exciting question. I don't know if there's a reshaping going on, because the residual violences are still there, and they're intimate violences, right? So they're violences often perpetrated in the name of civilization, right? In the name of respectability. And to me, what's at stake is, what does it mean to allow yourself to be uncomfortable? Because to me, discomfort is incredibly generative. And it's not because, when I say discomfort, I don't mean injury, right? I don't mean that that what's happening here is that we are opening ourselves up to being wounded. That's not what I'm talking about. That's something very different. Discomfort is something short of injury that makes us ask, what am I feeling? Discomfort is a profound feeling that we search for answers to because we want to get out of it. We often, what we want to do is want to go and find the perpetrator. But sometimes we bring those wounds and those injuries, and we bring that vulnerability. And allowing ourselves to feel that discomfort means we're asking questions. To me, that's what's at stake. Oh, I thought someone was asking me something already. but to me, again, that I find that the most profound and satisfying thing that art can do is make us ask questions about things we take for granted, even if they are the sensitivities and the intimacies we hold dearest. And that's what's at stake, is how can we allow ourselves to see things, feel things that we don't always want to see, feel, or think about, and walk away with broader insights into ourselves, broader insights into how artwork can get us there, how artwork can get us to examine uncomfortable histories, how artwork can get us to examine uncomfortable relationships, and how it can also get us to talk to each other about those. And that, to me, is what's at stake. Because, we're living in a world that's full of violence, full of disrespect, full of belittlement and meanness and incivility, utter incivility. And if we can actually create forms of dialogue around the things that make us uncomfortable, and the historical baggage that we bring into a room that usually won't let us talk about that. I mean, that's an extraordinary place to be. And I feel like that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Sort of coming back a little bit to, we spoke about the gaze just now, and you sort of shared how your sort of conceptualization or the framework you've developed shifts from hooks. And there's something interesting, I think, that happens when you move through the space. For example, with Big Girl 2, Big Girl 1, there's a certain sort of confidence in those figures. And they quite literally and conceptually take up space in quite a profound, I think, quite a profound way. Yet there is a sort of refusal in legibility. You're not sure what these figures are necessarily thinking. They don't reveal everything to you as a visitor in the space. And I came across a line that you had written, quote, "A black gaze rejects traditional understandings of spectatorship by refusing to allow its subject to be consumed by its viewers." And this seems to reflect what is happening as well in the space, that there is also a sort of holding back, a holding of the space and then a holding back. So I'd like to ask you how you read, if you feel that that is a reading that you respond to, and if you read these figures in a similar way.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Hard yes. Yes, I do. I mean, how should I put this? Refusal is a really, really important term for me. Because, and it's not what I think other people always mean by it. In Big Girl 1 and 2, I think they're really splendid examples of something else that I think is going on in terms of what kinds of refusals the work is actually activating. And I think of them as, it's something that I started out by saying, is that who is being scrutinized when you walk through these rooms? When you look at these works, who's being scrutinized? None of these individuals, none of those, the faces, none of the subjects are being scrutinized. They are sort of radically inscrutable, right? Kind of radically inscrutable. And one of the ways in which I understand that, and what I appreciate so much about the work, is that it really is, as a whole, this exhibition is kind of, to me, could have been called opacity. You know, it could have been a case study in what opacity is. And it's not opacity in the way that people want to misunderstand opacity as being opaque and unknowable, right? It's opacity in that sort of classic glissant way, where he's talking about opacity as the refusal to be reduced. You cannot be, the refusal to be transparent, to be understandable in simple terms. And instead, what he's actually talking about is that opacity is the fundamental form of connection that we have in terms of not being fully knowable. Right? And so those different gazes are about, you can see me, but you don't know me. You can see me, and you don't have to know me to be able to connect with me. And you have to accept that you will never know me, that you will never have full and complete access to me, to my interior. And that is the condition of my capacity to actually connect to you, because you are actually demanding that of me as well, right? So when Glissant talks about, you know, clamoring for the right to opacity, he's not saying, I do not want you to ever know me. He's saying, you don't have to know me, and your acceptance of not being able to ever know the full wholeness of my complexity makes you accept me. And I think that that's what these figures are, that the many layers of juxtaposition, and quite literally of collage, are creating a boundary, right, and an opening at the same time. Because again, you're seeing all these layers of depth and all these layers of contradiction, right? is this somebody who's terribly vulnerable, or is this somebody who's extremely guarded, right? Both,
Yes.
right? So the refusal is the refusal to be reduced and to insist upon that multiplicity, those contradictions, as the fundamental basis of Black subjectivity, I think, right? And if we can, again, that's another one of the things that I'm trying to argue in terms of a Black gaze, is that there is a refusal that has to be accepted as the basis for communication, right? That you will never be in that position. So one of the things I talk about is if a Black gaze is not a Black perspective, right? Does that mean that one can never understand it? Probably not, but what difference does that make, right? We're never going to know how our dogs are thinking, and we adore them. You know, we never know what our cats are thinking, and we would always, you know, want them to be close. That's the condition of love, not complete understanding, but that you will, on some level, accept those differences, those fundamental differences. And so, in that way, to me, that's what opacity is about.
And it's interesting because as you move through the exhibition, there's moments, of course, that even the very architecture of the exhibition is revealing and concealing
Absolutely.
different aspects of the work. And within the works, there's moments of opacity and then very sort of strategic moments of legibility.
Right, and that we have to do the work to do that.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the thing about spatially, is that you can't just walk down a line on a wall. You have to stand up on your tiptoes, some of us. You have to, I do. You have to look down really low. And you have to sort of, you know, have to walk around upstairs the dice, right?
Yeah.
You have to walk around it. I was trying to be very dignified, but I was almost on my knees, you know, trying to just sort of crawl around it and see every detail of it. You know, standing on my tiptoes, trying to see the bottom of something, trying to go backwards and forwards upstairs, you know, looking at the different folds. I mean, even here, looking at the different folds and having to come close and then to go all the way back there to get the full view of it. And then to be able to be forced to position yourself in relationship to art, I think is always a gift, right? Because again, to me, this is also the other thing that I talk about is I've stopped writing about it. There was a brief moment when I was writing about art that I hadn't seen in person. And it was an abject failure because people would tell me what it looked like and what it felt like in that space. And I've given it up because I really want to see artwork under the conditions that an artist wants me to see them. And that anything else, I'm always going to miss something, and I don't want to miss it. So having to do the work that an artist wants me to do in a gallery space as it's installed, I also think of as an enormous gift.
So I'd like to just touch on this collage technique that we've sort of begun discussing. And so there's a sense that, of course, many Dada artists in the 20th century and many artists that were part of a number of social movements, a political movement in the civil rights, second wave feminism, the advent of gay liberation, have used collage as a sort of mechanism for to critique social and political structures. And yet there's a sense that perhaps it has moved and become something else, that it has become a sort of what art historian Yuval Edgert calls a sweeping visual dialectic that extends into other disciplines or cross disciplines. And so my question here is, do you think that Orupabo and Jaffa as well, I was thinking through 444, and of course love is the message is death. Do you think that they renew or build upon this tradition in a way? Or do you think what they're doing, this sort of affective labor of juxtaposition, is quite distinct from that sort of lineage?
I have actually been thinking about this because I don't want to get trapped. I don't want to get trapped in saying no or yes. And so I'm going to be specific. Specific in terms of the lineage that I think that they're in. And that's a lineage that I think of, that I really do think, I identify with somebody like Romare Bearden.
Yeah.
Right? And as a Black feminist, one that I also identify with somebody like Kara Walker, Lorna Simpson, even somebody like Wangechi Mutu. And there, again, I think that there is a fundamental move to use collage as a mechanism of defamiliarization. But the added thing that I think that's really interesting is the extent to which both Frida and AJ are playing around with the monstrous in really phenomenal ways that make us question the history of Black subjection in particular. I think that Wangechi Mutu is doing that as well, and where sort of the monstrous bleeds into the fantastic, right? And it gets transformed from this kind of colonial aesthetic of the nativist and the primitive that becomes something that is actually futuristic. And it creates the possibility of seeing beyond the human, right? So that when the Black female body can go from, this notion of darkness and primitivism through collage into these kind of supernatural figures. And that's where I see them going, right? Is I see these possibilities evolving. That's another thing, like even within a collage that is the reclined figure of the odalisque, right? And, the history of the Black odalisque as a prone figure, right? In this exhibition, the odalisque becomes this like incredibly powerful, female at rest, who is also regal, right? Who is also kind of reigning. And so what does it mean to take these tropes and through collage and defamiliarization, right, we're defamiliarizing the negative trope that we might associate it with and spinning it in a completely different direction. And that different direction is a direction of possibility, is a direction of agency, it's a direction whereby we suddenly have to reevaluate, again, the kind of linear history of, okay, it's taking this particular trajectory, as if we know where it's going to end. We don't know where it's going to end. And that's the thing that I think the combination of this kind of layered collage approach, and which particular tropes? The tropes of the monster, the tropes of the subjected body, right? Can be rearticulated into something different.
So throughout the exhibition, and one of the sort of developments, I think, within the last few years of Frida's work, you see images and references to home, to childhood. It's very present as you move through the exhibition. And there's a line in your book where you say, much too often Black life is rendered in ways that allow it to be engaged at a safe distance. And this comes back to, a few of the things you've said earlier, but much too often Black life is rendered in ways that allow it to be engaged at a safe distance or viewed at arm's length through a lens of pity, sympathy, or concern. It is a temporary point of connection, visited and left behind in the face of an inevitable return to the comfort and comforting perspective of self and home. But Orupabo, Frida seems to complicate this. It is very difficult to sort of return to a comfortable sense of home and self when you spend time with these works. She sort of, in a way, short circuits that. And there's something there in which I think is quite powerful in Frida's work.
Right.
And thinking through, of course, your writing on that subject specifically.
Yeah. I mean, when I was writing that, I was actually talking about Dina Lawson's work, and And Dina Lawson's work is one of those, was for me a really important, she's a really important artist, Black artist in particular, because she makes Black people uncomfortable, quite literally. She brings out the kind of like, woo, that's coming too close to airing our dirty laundry in public, right? And that's where, that was one of the most profound places where I, wanted to make the case that a Black gaze was not about Black folk and how we see. Because I think her Black gaze makes Black people uncomfortable. And we have to own that. We have to own the extent to which we still, have a need for respectability. And that we enforce certain codes amongst ourselves of what respectability is. And those who violate those codes are, seen as not good enough or questionable. And particularly in that case, I think the connection must be made, is that home, the familiar, the family, are sites of extraordinary violence. They can be sites of intimate violence. And we don't want to talk about that. And so I think that it is the intimacy of the home that makes it such a place of vulnerability. And actually being able to enunciate that in a way that is not didactic, in a way that is not, an announcement, is very challenging. What has to be done is you have to be taken into this intimate site in order to feel those violences, in order to connect to those. And connect to them not as things that are happening, but as potential, right? Because the vulnerability of intimacy both makes it more terrifying, right? And more wounding. So opening the door on that, I think is really important. And opening the door on particularly the fact that the home historically for Black communities in colonization, for Black communities in apartheid, for Black communities in Jim Crow, for Black communities of captives, right? The domestic space was always one of the most vulnerable and violent. So carrying that forward into today, I think it's an act of extraordinary courage. Courage. To be able to make that the center of our conversations. And I think it's an act of courage both for the artist and for us to be able to inhabit that.
So I wanted to, thank you for that. I wanted to return to an earlier text of yours, listening to images. Yeah. And we touched on this a little bit yesterday with Frida. And just to ask you what you mean by this sort of idea of listening to images. Yeah. What does it sort of encompass? And I'm thinking now, of course, of a particular work in the exhibition, The Sound I Saw, just right there. Just there.
Yeah.
What does this sort of idea of listening to an image suggest or encompass?
The way in which I describe listening to images is it's a practice of allowing oneself to encounter images as if they were sound, which might seem like an odd proposition, but sound is fundamentally physical. Sound is fundamentally about movement. It's about the vibration of particles in the air. And the only way we can experience sound is if it makes physical contact with us. You can experience sound as vibration by just, if this table were rumbling, right? There are these speaker boxes that are made for deaf people, that they can experience music by laying on a speaker that vibrates. And that is the fundamental experience of sound. It doesn't have to have pitch, right? It has to have a frequency of vibration, right? So we, people who can hear at a certain level, we experience it through our eardrums, but we also experience it through our hands. You can experience it underwater, right? Pardon?
Through our body.
Through your body, contact with your body. We can't experience all forms of sound, you know, some of them are beyond our capacity to experience it. But my proposition is, what if we allowed images, artwork, visual culture, what if we were to have a physical relationship to images? What that means to me is that we allow it to make them, we allow artwork, visual artwork, to make contact with us. That means we attune ourselves to what does it solicit, what kind of responses does it draw from us. And so it goes back to what I was saying sort of in a broader sense. What does it mean to encounter this exhibition in a way that it wasn't just about what is it telling you or what are you seeing, but what does it feel like? What do these images make you feel? And so that, to me, is a different encounter with art. And to me, it's about, it requires a different practice of writing. So I don't call what I do writing about art, it's writing to art. And part of that has to do with my own training, which is outside of art history, and a sense of accountability to both anybody who would read my work, as well as to the artists who made it, which is, I can never tell an artist what they've done, what they've created. And I can never tell you what you see. All I can do is say what this made me feel and how it prompted me to respond. And that, to me, is listening to images and listening to artworks, is to be involved in a dialogue where you're accountable to what those images make you feel and how they make you respond. And I guess that what I want to do is invite everyone here to do that, to listen to the artworks in the show for those of you who both have and have not seen it yet.